Let me start with a simple question. When you think about the constitution, whose voice do you hear? The judge, the lawyer, the politician, or do you hear your own? Because for 75 years, India has run on a quiet assumption. Constitutional interpretation is the business of experts. People like me, people in courts, people who speak a certain language, write a certain way, and move through a certain world. But here's the twist. The constitution was never written for experts. It was written for citizens. It was written for the people who would live under it, question it, fight with it, shape it. And somewhere along the journey, we stopped asking whether citizens are supposed to be passive spectators or active interpreters. Tonight, I want to open a door most constitutional conversations avoid. The question is simple, but the implications are enormous. Can citizens become co-interpreters of the constitution? Not replacing the courts, not replacing parliament, but joining the dialogue. This isn't a theoretical exercise. You already see glimpses of it everywhere, from Sabrimala to farm laws, from same-sex marriages debates to CAA protest. India's constitutional journey is no longer confined to courtrooms and committees. It's happening in streets, WhatsApp group, YouTube channels, dinner table arguments. People who have never stepped inside a law library are now speaking in the language of rights and duties. And here's the thing, when millions of people begin interpreting the constitution in real time, the state can't pretend it's business as usual. The constitutional republic begins to shift. Power begins to leak out of institutions and into public consciousness. The question is, should that scare us or excite us? Is this chaos or is this evolution? Is this mob rule or is this the next phase of Indian democracy? Different countries have wrestled with this dilemma in very different ways. Some invite citizens in, some shut the door firmly. India has been somewhere in the middle, proud of its democracy, but protective of its constitutional gatekeepers. But the 21st century doesn't respect old boundaries. The internet has turned every citizen into a publisher, every opinion into a broadcast, every debate into a public referendum, and whether we like it or not, constitutional meaning is now being shaped outside the courtroom as much as inside it. Today's episode is not just an analysis, it is a thought experiment. It's a blueprint, it's a warning, and maybe, if we are brave enough, it's a vision. If the constitution belongs to the people, then the people must have a voice in how it lives, how it breathes, how it adapts. But that also means the people carry responsibility, discipline, and a sense of history. This episode is about finding that balance, the thin line where citizens participate without derailing, where courts guide without controlling, where democracy grows without collapsing into noise. So let's begin, and let's start at the only place that makes sense, the idea itself. Part 1 is about the idea of the citizens interpreting the constitution. Let me begin with a scene that plays out in every Indian home, every day without anyone noticing its constitutional stakes. A family sits at a dinner, someone mentions a protest, another mentions a Supreme Court judgment, someone else says they read something on social media, and suddenly you have a full-blown constitutional interpretation unfolding on the dining table. No robes, no citations, no legal jargon, just instinct, memory, identity, belief, fear, all clashing in the most democratic theater we have, ordinary conversation. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, what is that? Is it politics? Is it gossip? Or is it constitutional interpretation in its rawest form? Because here's the thing, every time a citizen tries to understand what the state can or cannot do, they are entering the world of constitutional meaning. They might not know whether Article 14 or 19 or the basic structure doctrine, but they know when something feels unjust, unreasonable, excessive, or unfair. And that instinct is not trivial. It is a moral oxygen of our constitutional republic. We have been taught that constitutional interpretation is a sacred ritual reserved for courts, that only judges, lawyers, and scholars have the authority to say what the constitution means, but that story, while comforting, is not entirely true. Let me put it bluntly. A constitution that lives only in courtrooms is a dead constitution. A constitution that only judges can interpret is an elite project, not a democratic covenant. This document, the one Ambedkar called a social contract between state and individual, was never meant to be a one-way lecture. It was supposed to be a dialogue, and a dialogue doesn't survive if only one side gets to speak. But there is a reason we hesitate to accept this idea. India is a civilization that reveres authority. We trust elders, teachers, institutions, even if they don't earn that trust. We have a historic instinct to let someone else tell us what the rule means. And that instinct quietly shaped our constitutional journey. Courts became the interpreters, citizens became the audience. But something has changed. Actually, many things have changed all at once. The internet blew up the gatekeeping of information. YouTube turned experts into participants. WhatsApp created an illusion of collective interpretation. Sometimes wise, sometimes reckless. Protests began citing constitutional text on placards. Movements started invoking Ambedkar without ever reading the Constituent Assembly debates. People began watching live stream of Supreme Court hearings as if they were watching a series finale of a political thriller. What this means is simple. The monopoly is broken. Interpretation is no longer vertical, it's horizontal. But is this a good thing? Let's take a step back. Let's go to a moment before the Constitution existed. When the Constituent Assembly met in 1946, the members did not imagine a silent population obeying a sacred text. They imagined citizens reshaping democracy through debate, disagreement, and dissent. There is a beautiful line by Rajendra Prasad where he says, quote, "Strength of this constitution will depend on the people who work it," unquote. Not the judges, not the lawyers, the people. So if citizens were always meant to animate the constitution, why do we behave like they are outsiders to its interpretation? Because we confuse legality with legitimacy. Legality belongs to institutions, legitimacy belongs to people. And these two are not the same thing. A judgment can be legally sound and publicly rejected. A law can be procedurally valid and morally illegitimate. A constitutional amendment can follow every rule and still violate the soul of the republic. We have seen this play out again and again and again. The Sabrimala judgment, legally correct in its reasoning, socially rejected in the outcome. The farm laws, legislatively passed, democratically collapsed. The CAA, constitutionally arguable, socially combustible. The same-sex marriage case, judicially impossible, publicly unavoidable. The hijab case, framed as a dress code, lived as an identity. In every one of these controversies, citizens interpreted the constitution before the courts could finish their paragraphs, and that tells us something essential. Constitutional meaning is not created in marble halls. It is created in public consciousness. But if people are going to interpret the constitution anyway, the real question is, should the state fear this? Should courts resist this? Or should we build a system that embraces and guides it? Let me be honest. Citizen interpretation is a messy. It's emotional, it's inconsistent, it's often misinformed. But so is democracy, and yet we trust democracy with power. Why? Because democracy is not a clean system, it's a human system. It absorbs contradiction, it survives chaos, it grows through argument, not obedience. In fact, the greatest danger to the constitutional democracy is not disagreement. It is silence. A silent citizenry is a dream of a dictatorship, not a republic. So what does citizens interpreting the constitution actually mean? It means recognizing that the constitution is not a closed book. It is a living conversation, and if citizens are excluded from that conversation, then the constitution becomes a fossil, admired, respected, but dead. But interpretation doesn't mean every person must become a lawyer. It means they must develop constitutional intuition. They must understand the basic grammar of rights. They must recognize when the state oversteps. They must know which freedoms cannot be negotiated, no matter which party is in power. Let me put it another way. Citizens don't need to quote Article 21 to know that dignity matters. They don't need to cite a judgment to recognize injustice. They don't need legal language to sense when power is being misused. The Constitution survives because ordinary people develop an instinct for liberty. And that instinct becomes sharper when interpretation becomes participatory. So here is the core idea of this act. Citizens are already interpreting the Constitution. The question is not whether we should allow it. We are long past that. The question is how we guide it, structure it, elevate it, and prevent it from being hijacked by misinformation and demagoguery. Because interpretation without structure becomes noise. But structure without citizen participation becomes authoritarian. The space between these two is where the future of India's constitutional republic will be decided. And that brings us to our next step. Not India, but the world. Other democracies have tried to answer this question. Some succeeded, some failed, and each one has a lesson for us. Act 2 of this lecture is about how other democracies experiment with direct constitutional engagement. Let's step outside India for a moment, because sometimes the best way to understand what we can become is to study what others dare to attempt. Now, I'm not doing the usual textbook tour, not the brochure version of democracy. I'm talking about real experiments, real risk, real moments when ordinary citizens stepped into the arena of constitutional meaning. Let's begin with the country people rarely associate with innovation, Iceland. After the financial collapse of 2008, Iceland was furious. Banks had failed. Politicians had resigned. The public had lost trust in every institution. But here's the twist. Instead of letting elites rewrite the constitution behind closed doors, Iceland said something radical. Let the people draft the constitution. Not symbolically, literally. They opened an online portal. Citizens discussed, debated, argued, and submitted clauses. A committee of 25 ordinary Icelanders, teachers, farmers, activists, lawyers, reviewed thousands of public comments. The drafting happened live, online, like a public Google Doc. Imagine that for a second. Not a constitution imposed from above, a constitution written from below. Now the final draft didn't fully pass because of a political resistance. But that's not the point. The point is this. Iceland proved that constitutional engagement doesn't have to be limited to courts and parliaments. Citizens can reshape the text itself. But Iceland is a small country. People often dismiss it as an exception. So let's go to Switzerland, where direct democracy is not an experiment but a habit. Switzerland holds multiple referendums every year. Not symbolic referendums, binding referendums. The public votes directly on laws, constitutional amendments, social policies, and sometimes absurd questions like should cows keep their horns? And yet, this system works. Why? Because Swiss people are trained from childhood to understand constitutional stakes. Civic education isn't a chapter in a textbook. It's a cultural practice. Now imagine India with binding referendums. Imagine 900 million voters deciding GST, farm laws, Article 370 or same-sex marriage. The idea feels impossible, maybe dangerous, because we don't have the civic culture. Switzerland has cultivated for a century, and that's exactly the lesson. Direct constitutional dialogue requires preparation. It requires an informed public. It requires trust in institutions. It requires rules that cannot be gamed by political actors. Let's move to the United States, where constitutional meaning isn't created by courts alone. Sure, the Supreme Court has enormous power, but public activism shapes outcomes long before a case reaches Washington. Think of Brown versus Board of Education. The court outlawed segregation, yes, but the movement began in churches, neighborhoods, student groups. Think of Roe versus Wade. The court recognized the right to privacy, but the backlash and counter movements shaped the next 50 years of politics. Think of same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court ruled in 2015, but the cultural acceptance came from decades of public conversation, pride marches, and social campaigns. Here is the real insight. In the US, constitutional change is driven by cultural pressure, long before it becomes legal reality. The court follows the country, not the other way around. Let's look at Kenya, which adopted a new constitution in 2010. The process was deeply participatory. Citizens gave input through hearings, public forums, consultations, and local assemblies. The Constitutional Commission traveled across the country, listening to grievances, aspirations. The final document wasn't written in isolation, it was forged through public dialogue. Kenya teaches us something vital. Public participation gives legitimacy, even when political stability is fragile. Now, contrast this with China, a place where the constitution exists but people have zero interpretive power. The constitution promises rights, but the party interprets and enforces them. No dialogue, no dissent, no consultation. What China shows is the opposite lesson. A constitution without public engagement becomes a political instrument, not a social contract. And then there is the European Union. The EU attempted something ambitious in 2005. A constitution for Europe. It was drafted by elected representatives, debated across countries, and put to referendums in France and the Netherlands. What happened? The public rejected it, not because they hated the idea of Europe, but because they felt disconnected from the process. They felt the document was written in elite language by elite institutions for elite goals. That failure tells us another truth. Even a well-written constitution will fail if people don't feel ownership over it. So what do all these experiments teach us? 3 lessons stand out. First, citizens take constitutional dialogue seriously when institutions trust them with power. When you treat people like adults, they rise to the challenge. When you treat them like subjects, they disengage, or worse, they rebel. Second, direct constitutional engagement works only when civic culture is built deliberately. This means education, transparency, communication, and institutional humility. A public that is excluded becomes vulnerable to misinformation. A public that is included becomes a participant. Third, no democracy can ignore its people forever. Even the strongest courts cannot impose meaning when society refuses to accept it. Even the most powerful governments cannot sustain laws that citizens reject morally. And that brings us to India. Because India is not Iceland, India is not Switzerland, India is not US, India is a civilization wrapped in democracy. A billion voices, layered identities, and an extraordinary hunger for participation. Which raises a real question: where do Indian citizens stand in the hierarchy of constitutional meaning? What tools do they have? What spaces exist for them? That's what we explore next. Part 3 of this lecture is about India's existing structures, PILs, public hearing, referendums, or the absence of them. Let's come home now, because before we imagine a future where citizens shape constitutional meaning, we need to understand what tools they already have and what tools they never got. And the truth is a bit uncomfortable. India is a loud democracy, but the constitution gives citizens far fewer structural avenues than we like to think. Let's start with the most famous democratic weapon, the PIL. We treat PILs as if they are some ancient tradition of empowerment. But PILs weren't born from the constitution. They were born from judicial frustration. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, India had a silent emergency inside its legal system. The poorest had no access to courts. Fundamental rights existed only on paper. Justice P.N. Bhagwati and Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer stepped in and said, fine, if the system won't open its doors, we will. Write us a postcard. Send a letter. Tell us what's being done to you and we will treat it as a petition. That's how PILs began. Not as citizen power, but as a judicial compassion. But like every extraordinary idea, PILs mutated. They were meant for bonded laborers, prisoners, pavement dwellers. They became a playground for policy advisors, policy activists, political actors, retired bureaucrats, and attention-seeking NGOs. Sometimes PILs did extraordinary good, the right to food case, the Vishaka guidelines, environmental protection. Sometimes PILs did questionable things, bans, moral policing, interventions in policy decisions that should have remained political, not judicial. But here's the key point. PILs allow citizens to approach the court, but they don't allow citizens to interpret the constitution. The court still deciding the meaning, the citizen only triggers the conversation. Now, what about public hearings? We love the idea. We imagine a US style system where congressional committees grill stakeholders, experts give testimony, civil society participates, and legislation becomes a national debate. But India's parliament doesn't work like that. Few bills are referred to standing committees today. Even fewer incorporate public opinion. Hearings, when they happen, are often symbolic, dominated by bureaucrats, not citizens. At the state level, it's even weaker. Most laws are drafted internally. Public participation is rare. Consultation documents are short, technical, perfunctory. So, yes, technically, public hearings exist, but they don't create constitutional dialogue. They create administrative feedback. Now, let's talk about the tool India never embraced at all: referendums. In most democracies, referendums exist for fundamental questions, constitutional changes, political restructuring, independence movements. But India has no referendum mechanism at the union level, none. We are a nation that voted in Constituent Assembly. We elected lawmakers. We created a parliamentary republic. But we never created a system for direct public ratification of constitutional amendments or major laws. Why? Because the framers were afraid, deeply afraid of a mass manipulation, communal passions, and emotional majoritarianism. Partition was fresh. Violence was fresh. Distrust was fresh. Ambedkar and Nehru both believed that referendums in India could destroy the country before it's even stabilized. So they kept constitutional change in the hands of parliament, not the people. Now, here's the paradox. Even without referendums, India has always had public mobilization, shaping constitutional meaning. Think of the anti-Hindu protest in Tamil Nadu, the Mandal agitation, the JP movement, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the Anna Hazare movement, the Shah Bano backlash, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, the Nirbhaya protest, the CAA and NRC protest, farm law protest. None of these changed the constitution on paper, but all of them changed the political possibilities. They changed what parliament could dare to do. They changed what courts were comfortable deciding. They changed the national narrative. This is India's real referendum culture, not ballots, but streets. But the streets, unlike a referendum booth, have no rules, no clear outcomes, no structured dialogue, only pressure. So, what does it mean? It means India has half a system, a loud citizenry, but limited constitutional channels, a powerful judiciary, but limited public legitimacy for some interventions, a centralized parliament, but weak participatory mechanism. We created a democracy that speaks loudly but listens selectively. Now let's map the real problem. India has 140 crore people but no constitutional mechanism for citizens to directly influence constitutional amendments, structural reforms, electoral changes, or federal negotiations. We have citizen energy without citizen architecture. That's the vacuum this debate sits inside. And if you are wondering why this matters now, look around. Every major constitutional controversy in the last decade has been shaped by public anger or public silence. Sabrimala, where social revolt collided with judicial morality. Triple Talaq, where communal sensitivity mixed with constitutional arguments. Same-sex marriage, where the court asked the society to revolve and society said not yet. CAA, where the law was passed by parliament but challenged on streets. Farm laws, enacted centrally, repealed because of mass mobilization. Hijab, where constitutional rights met with cultural identity in classrooms. In each of these cases, citizens were participants but not interpreters, not decision makers, not co-authors of meaning. This is India's central tension. We have mass politics but elite constitutionalism. And this brings us to the next step, the part nobody wants to confront. If citizens are going to interpret the constitution, what happens when misinformation, passion, and digital manipulation take control? That's our next act. Act 4 is about the risk, misinformation, emotion, populism, digital manipulation. Let me get straight to the uncomfortable truth. The idea of citizens acting as interpreters of the constitution sounds noble. It sounds democratic. It feels empowering. But here's the thing. democracies are not destroyed by dictators alone. Many fall because citizens get manipulated into believing they are acting freely, when in reality they are being steered. So before we romanticize this idea of big constitutional dialogue with the public, we have to confront the darker layers of our own society and our digital ecosystem. If people are to interpret the constitution, we must ask, who is shaping the people? Let's start with misinformation. Not the funny WhatsApp was forward your uncle sends, but the sophisticated, targeted, emotion hacking. Misinformation that can turn any constitutional debate into a battlefield. Imagine a constitutional discussion on free speech happening online. 1 hour in, you will see fact-free narratives, bots amplifying outrage, half-truths dressed as legal analysis, and content that's designed to bypass your mind and go straight to your emotions. And this isn't hypothetical. During the farm law protest, misinformation flowed on all sides. During CAA and NRC debates, fake documents circulated like wildfire. Whenever a major judgment drops from the Supreme Court, privacy, Sabrimala, Aadhaar, same-sex marriage, the immediate reaction is dominated by misinformation, not legal reasoning, not constitutional principles, just noise. And when noise becomes the dominant public sentiment, any constitutional dialogue with citizens become fragile. Because the constitution requires clarity, depth, structural thinking, not reaction. But misinformation is only one layer. There is something even more dangerous: emotion. The constitution was deliberately designed as a counter to emotional decision making. Ambedkar did this very consciously. He wanted a document that would not bend every time society get angry, frightened, polarized, or moved by questions of the moment. Now imagine giving citizens the power to directly shape constitutional interpretations. What happens when the issue is something like Sabrimala? The public reaction was instant, raw, and deeply emotional. Imagine if constitutional meaning itself shifted every time emotion surged. We would have no continuity, no stability, and no protection for minorities. Because minorities don't win emotional battles. Take the hijab controversy. Within hours, the entire debate was hijacked by emotion. Nuanced style, interpretation collapsed into slogans, and this tells us something fundamental. Even well-educated citizens often default to identity-based reactions rather than constitutional reasoning. So if we invite citizens into constitutional interpretation, we must accept that emotion walks in first. Now add populism to the mix. Populism is powerful because it tells people what they want to hear. It creates villains, heroes, and quick solutions. But the constitution was designed to resist exactly this, to act as a speed breaker on the impulses of the majority. If a constitutional dialogue becomes dominated by populism, the very groups the constitution seeks to protect, women, minorities, dissenters, the powerless, will be the first casualties. Because populism doesn't like complexity, it doesn't like rights, it doesn't like checks and balances, it only likes power. And then comes the final risk, perhaps the most modern one: digital manipulation. We no longer live in a world where public opinions emerges organically. It is engineered, it is manufactured. An algorithm you have never met decides what you see. A micro-targeted ad you never realize is an ad nudge how you think. Two people living in the same house may be living in completely different realities because their feeds are personalized constitutional universes. Hello? Anji, hold kar yaar. 7582. Imagine a constitutional debate on privacy happening in such a digital environment. It will not be a debate. It will be a psychological experiment. A few thousand targeted messages can shift the sentiment of an entire state. And if public sentiment shifts, courts feel the tremor. Judicial courage doesn't exist in a vacuum. Social pressure matters. Political messaging matters. Perception matters. So let's be honest. A system where citizens directly engage with the constitution can be beautiful, but it can also be hijacked, weaponized, distorted, turned into a battlefield where the constitution loses, not because people don't care, but because people never had the right information, the right tools, or the right cognitive space to participate meaningfully. And here's the irony we don't like to accept. Sometimes The most popular view is the most unconstitutional view. Sometimes the loudest view is the least informed. And sometimes the majority needs to be protected from itself. If we want citizens to interpret the constitution, we first need citizens who are insulated from digital manipulation. Citizens who are informed, citizens who are calm enough to reason, citizens who don't see every issue as a tribal war. Without that, constitutional dialogue becomes political theatre and the constitution becomes a prop. This is the reality we have to confront before we move forward. And in the next act, we will explore the other side, not the danger but the possibility. What happens when citizens finally become co-authors in the meaning of their own constitution? Act 5 of this lecture is about the possibilities. Constitutional dialogue in the age of internet. Let's shift gears. We have talked about the risk. They are real. They are serious. They can derail the entire idea of citizens engaging with the constitution. But here is the other side of the story. If India manages to harness the strengths of this generation, not just its anxieties, we might unlock something extraordinary. Because for the first time in human history, 1 billion people carry a library, a classroom, a public square, and a courtroom in their pocket. Your phone is not just a device, it's a gateway to the constitutional consciousness. Think about what was impossible 30 years ago. If you wanted to understand a Supreme Court judgment, you needed newspapers, law libraries, maybe a lawyer friend who had time to explain. Today, a young student in Meghalaya can read the Ayodhya judgment with the same ease as a professor in Delhi. A homemaker in Jaipur can listen to debates on Article 14, Article 21 and privacy rights while cooking dinner. This has never happened in any other era. Never. And this changes the game. Because once people gain access to the text of the constitution, they start asking questions that were earlier unthinkable. Why do we need sedition? Why is bail a problem in India? Why does the state decide what we can watch or read? Why are certain rights interpreted narrowly and others expensively? This question asking is the seed of constitutional citizenship. And it's already happening. Look at the student movements. From the protest during CAA to the national conversations around the Puttaswamy judgment. Young people were not quoting political leaders. They were quoting the constitution. They were referencing K.C. Puttaswamy, Shreya Singhal, Navtej Jauhar, Joseph Shine. How many countries in the world have citizens casually referencing their Supreme Court judgments? Not many. And then look at the evolution of citizen journalism. Every time the court hears a major case, whether it's same-sex marriage, farm law stay, demonetization review, electoral bond disclosures, thousands of people live tweet legal updates, break down arguments and explain procedural nuances in real time. Some of this is very messy, yes. But buried inside the chaos is something remarkable. A hunger to understand the system. People are no longer content being ruled by the constitution. They want to participate in the shaping it. This is the beginning of constitutional awakening. And here's another possibility that's easy to miss. When citizens start engaging deeply with constitutional debates, the quality of public discourse slowly starts improving. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in pockets, small but powerful pockets. You see real depth. Online spaces where people discuss the Sabrimala judgment, not only through faith or tradition, but through Article 25, Article 26, and the idea of essential religious practices. Spaces where people debate the privacy implications of Aadhaar, using the language of proportionality, necessity, and minimal intrusion. Spaces where people talk about same-sex marriage, not as a moral question, but as a constitutional question about dignity and autonomy. These conversations, even if imperfect, push the culture upward. Because once a person understands the constitution, they start recognizing injustice. They start spotting arbitrary power. They start understanding their rights. And here is the most powerful thing. They become harder to manipulate. A constitution literate society cannot be easily polarized. It cannot be easily frightened. It cannot be easily divided. And this is exactly why constitutional dialogue with citizens is not a risk to democracy. It is a safeguard for democracy, provided it is done right. Imagine India with structured constitutional town halls. Imagine digital platforms where judgments are broken down in simple language by experts. Imagine school children learning not just about what the Constitution contains, but how to think constitutionally. Imagine millions of citizens participating in deliberative polls on key rights based issues. Not binding polls, but consultative ones, giving the judiciary and the legislature a sense of where the public stands, not emotionally, but after informed debate. Imagine something even more radical. An India where the Supreme Court, before deciding a major case, releases a short public brief explaining the constitutional questions involved, inviting citizens to engage in structured dialogue, not to decide the case. Courts must remain courts, but to deepen the country's constitutional mind. This is not utopian, this is a design. And the more citizens participate in constitutional thinking, the stronger the judiciary becomes. Why? Because the judiciary then stops being an elite island sitting on Raisina Hill. It becomes a moral institution supported by constitutional aware population. A court backed by constitution literate citizens is almost impossible to intimidate. That is the promise. A country where the constitution is not a document, not a slogan, not a chapter in a civics textbook, but a living language spoken by millions. A country where every citizen holds a small piece of the judicial conscience. This is the possibility. This is the destination. And in the next act, we have to draw the red lines because every possibility needs boundaries. And if we want citizens to participate in constitutional interpretation, we must decide where citizen power ends and judicial responsibility begins. Act 6 of this lecture is about the red lines, but courts must keep what people can claim. Let's step into the difficult part now, because every time we talk about direct citizen engagement with the Constitution, people either get excited or terrified. And the truth is, both reactions are justified. If citizens are going to enter the arena of constitutional dialogue, then we need boundaries, not to restrict people, but to protect the Constitution itself from becoming a playground for chaos. And here's the thing. Not all parts of constitutional interpretation can be democratized. Some domains must remain with the courts, untouched, unmoved, insulated from the public storms. Let's start right there. There are certain questions in a constitutional democracy that cannot be put to popular vote, no matter how loud the majority gets. Whether a person accused of a crime deserves a fair trial, that cannot depend on public anger. Whether a minority group deserves equal protection, that cannot depend on the mood of the nation. Whether a woman has autonomy over her body, that cannot depend on what a million strangers think on a given day. Whether a journalist can criticize the government, that cannot depend on which political party is ruling at that moment. These are not issues for public sentiment. These are the issues of constitutional morality, which means certain red lines belong to the judiciary alone. First red line is this. Rights cannot be outsourced to majoritarian interpretation. A society may choose its culture, a legislature may choose its policies, but rights derive from constitutional promises, not public mood. Let me say that again with clarity. Rights don't come from opinion polls. Rights come from human dignity. This is why you cannot crowdsource whether Muslims should keep their hijab. This is why you cannot crowdsource whether LGBTQ plus citizens can marry. This is why you cannot crowdsource whether tribal land rights can be diluted. Crowds can demand a road or a bridge or better schools, yes, but they cannot demand that someone else's freedom be reduced. That is not democracy, that is moral violence. So when we talk about constitutional dialogue, we are not talking about public approval. We are talking about public understanding. Courts must remain the final interpreters of rights. That is non-negotiable. But now, let's talk about the other side. What can citizens claim? Citizens can absolutely claim the right to participate in constitutional conversations, the right to comment on judgments, the right to question the logic of judicial reasoning, the right to demand transparency in how constitutional values are applied. Think about this. When the Supreme Court uses the doctrine of proportionalities, shouldn't citizens know what that means? When the court says essential religious practices, shouldn't people have the right to critique the doctrine? When the court expands Article 21, shouldn't the public debate how far that expansion should go? These are the spaces where citizens can and must step in. Let me give you a real world example. The Sabrimala judgment triggered massive backlash, not because people hated gender equality, but because the doctrine of essential religious practices was never explained to the public. It was technical, it was doctrinal, it was elite. And when a decision that deep meets a population that has no context, chaos is predictable. The judiciary didn't fail in its reasoning, it failed in communication. And then look at the hijab case in Karnataka. Schools banned hijabs, students protested. The matter went to the High Court, then to the Supreme Court, and the country split into two sides, all emotion. Very little constitutional literacy. Citizens were asking a simple question: is this about discipline or is it about religious freedom? But no one translated Article 25 for them. No one explained what public order, morality, and health really means, or really allow or prohibit. No one simplified the test courts use. So citizens debated in the dark. Judges decided in the light. The gap widened. This gap is what a constitutional dialogue model must erase. And then take the same-sex marriage case. The petitioners made deeply constitutional arguments: dignity, equality, autonomy. The bench was split. One set of judges said the state cannot deny marriage rights on grounds of sexual orientation. Another set said marriage is a legislative matter. And the public conversation, mostly about culture, Indian values, tradition, and family structure. The court spoke constitutional language. The public spoke cultural language, and the two streams never met. That's the problem. If you want citizens to engage in constitutional dialogue, then courts must also accept this. Judicial language must be understandable. Judicial reasoning must be accessible. Judicial decisions must be communicable. And here's another red line. Citizens cannot decide technical constitutional questions. Things like federal distribution of power, complex tax cases, interstate water disputes, separation of power questions, these need judicial precision, not public referendums. You cannot ask citizens to decide whether Article 131 applies. You cannot put special majority requirements to public vote. You cannot let citizens arbitrate whether the doctrine of basic structure applies to a specific amendment. These are not democratic questions. These are legal questions requiring serious legal tooling. But citizens can absolutely participate in the moral direction of constitutional interpretation. They can debate what equality should mean. They can decide what dignity should include. They can shape the cultural atmosphere in which rights evolve. So what does this balance look like in real life? It looks like this. Courts remain the file guardians. Citizens become the moral ecosystem. Courts hold the scalpel. Citizens hold the compass. Courts decide cases. Citizens decide the climate. And both need each other. Because courts without public legitimacy becomes weak, and public opinion without constitutional discipline becomes dangerous. The Constitution was never meant to be a judge's document alone. It was never meant to be locked inside courtrooms. It was meant to breathe through the people. But breathing is different from deciding. Feeling is different from interpreting. Participating is different from adjudicating. And that is where the red lines must be drawn. This brings us to the final act, the hardest one. How can India design a real, workable, modern system where citizens engage with the Constitution without destabilizing it? How do we build a model of constitutional dialogue that strengthens democracy rather than drowning it? Act 7 of this lecture is about a new model. India's path to citizen constitutionalism. Let's build a model now, not a fantasy, not a slogan, a serious workable architecture through which citizens can step into constitutional dialogue without destabilizing the republic. Because here's the truth, most countries won't say aloud. When the people and the constitution drift apart, the state becomes the only interpreter. And when the state becomes the only interpreter, democracy becomes decoration. India is standing exactly at that edge. Courts speak one language, citizens speak another, governments speak their own strategic dialect, and the constitution floats somewhere above everyone's head, distant, sacred, unread, misunderstood, misused. So, what does a real Indian model of citizen constitutionalism look like? It begins with something very simple. We bring the constitution down from the shelf and put it into public life again, but not in old textbook manner. Not a ceremonial object, not as a school lecture, not as a Republic Day prop. We bring it down as a living instrument, a political instrument, a moral instrument, a civic instrument. And we do it through 4 pillars. Let me lay the first one. Imagine a system where every major constitutional case, Sabrimala, Aadhaar, hijab, same-sex marriage, electoral bonds, is not just argued in court, but also opened up to a national civic forum, a structured, moderated, transparent platform where citizens can send questions, respond to reasoning, see summaries of arguments in plain language, not to influence the bench, but to create a constitutional conversation in parallel, something like a national constitutional forum. And before you think this is impossible, remember, Canada already does it. South Africa does it. Even the UK does it through their parliamentary committees. We just don't do it. We treat constitutional cases like elite rituals. Judges, lawyers, sealed files, Latin phrases, and public confusion. That's the first pillar, public comprehension. The second pillar is tougher but necessary, constitutional translation. We need a mechanism where every major judgment is explained in normal human language within 72 hours of delivery. Look at the hijab judgment. 3 months of national shouting could have been avoided if someone had explained in simple words what the court did or didn't do. Look at Sabrimala. The biggest failure was not the verdict. The biggest failure was silence. People didn't understand Article 25. They didn't understand essential religious practices. They didn't understand constitutional equality versus ritual autonomy. And when you give people no explanation, they fill the vacuum with emotion. We need a constitutional explanation office, independent, non-partisan, full of lawyers, educators, linguists, and communicators who break down the judgment for the country. Third pillar, citizen constitutional labs. Hear me out. Imagine young people from every district forming small civic circles, not political, not partisan, where they debate constitutional dilemmas every month. Should hate speech be criminalized further or not? Should privacy be absolute? Should bail be made mandatory for certain offences? Should defamation be civil, not criminal? Should social media be regulated by the state or by independent bodies? These are not law school questions. These are everyday questions. And they demand everyday engagement. But someone has to host them. Someone has to record them. Someone has to compile the insights. Courts won't do it. Governments won't do it. But civil society can. Universities can. Even creators and lawyers like us can build that infrastructure. These labs would become the country's moral sensors. A reading of what the public thinks, not in shouting matches, but in structured deliberation. And then the fourth pillar, the most controversial one, a limited, controlled mechanism for consultative constitutional feedback. Not voting, not referendums, not binding decisions, but something like a constitutional questionnaire. Let me illustrate. When a major constitutional issue comes up, say Uniform Civil Code, data privacy, or freedom of online speech, a national civic survey curated by constitutional experts is circulated to gather public sentiment in a structured way, not yes or no questions, but thoughtful prompts. What values should guide this area of law? What rights should be prioritized? What fears do you have? What protections do you want? What trade-offs are unacceptable? You're not deciding the law, you are informing the climate. Courts won't be bound by it, but they will understand the country's moral pulse better. Judges often say, we decide not based on public opinion, but on constitutional principle. Fair, that should never change. But understanding the public's anxieties is not the same as surrendering to the public's demands. This model works because it respects the judiciary's role while opening a door for citizens to engage responsibly. Now, let me show you the deeper meaning of all this. Right now, India's constitutional ecosystem has three voices: the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. The people, ironically, do not have a direct voice. We vote for representatives, yes, but we do not vote for constitutional meaning. Courts interpret, governments execute, parliament debates, citizens react. This is the backward model. Reactive, not proactive. Citizen constitutionalism flips that. It gives the people a space before the decision, not just after. A space of comprehension, not just outrage. A space of dialogue, not just protest. And now, let me tell you the most important part. People won't say constitutional literacy is not a luxury. It is a national security requirement because a population that cannot understand rights will never defend them. A population that cannot decode propaganda will always fall for it. A population that cannot engage with institutions will eventually turn against them. Citizen constitutionalism protects the republic from ignorance, the most dangerous destabilizer of all. But here's the final piece of this model. Everything I have said will collapse if we don't set the right boundaries. This cannot become a new battlefield for communal propaganda. This cannot become a new stage for political parties to manufacture outrage. This cannot become a new weapon for interest groups to pressure judges. This cannot become a parallel court. It must remain what the framers intended the republic to be: a conversation about rights, dignity, justice, and the future of the nation. And the conversation must always end with the courts, not the crowds, not the algorithms, not the influencers, not the majorities, not the loudest voices. Courts must keep the final word. That's the anchor. That's the non-negotiable. That's the reason the Constitution has survived every political storm for 75 years. But citizens must reclaim the first word, the questioning word, the reflective word, the interpretive word, the democratic word. Because if courts speak last, but citizens never speak first, the Constitution becomes a monologue. And a monologue cannot sustain a democracy. What we are trying to build here is a dialogue, not to weaken institutions, but to deepen them, not to challenge judicial authority, but to legitimize it through national understanding, not to rewrite the Constitution, but to finally read it together. This is the Indian path to citizen constitutionalism, not American, not European, not South African. Uniquely Indian, rooted in our diversity, our complexity, our arguments, our anxieties, our aspirations. A model where the Constitution is not a distant document, but a shared national language. And if we get this right, something extraordinary happens. The Republic becomes self-aware. The people become co-authors. The courts become interpreters in a richer moral universe. And democracy becomes more than elections. It becomes an ongoing civic conversation. This is the future waiting for us if we choose it. And now we move to the outro, a closing reflection on what this journey means for India's next 25 years. Tell me when you want me to begin. No headings, no framings. When we began this constitutional dialogue series, I had one simple intention: to bring the Constitution back into the room, back into the home, back into the public square, back into the country's bloodstream. Not as an exam syllabus, not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing compass for a democracy that is still growing into itself. Over these episodes, we have walked through fire, we have stepped into debates that institutions avoid. We have questioned power, courts, government, citizens, and even the Constitution itself, not to break faith with the Republic, but to renew it. And today, as we close this series, I want to say something clearly. Constitutional dialogue is not a YouTube format. It is a civic habit, a discipline, a responsibility, a form of national self-respect. If a country does not talk to its own constitution, it eventually becomes ruled by those who misuse it. Everything we discussed: free speech, federalism, secularism, equality, privacy, autonomy, judicial power, citizen power, these aren't abstract topics. They are the architecture of everyday life. Your life, your freedom, your future. The Constitution is not a book, it's a mirror. And in this series, all we tried to do was help India see itself more clearly. And this is not the end. The next hearing is shifting to a new phase, a new series, a deeper investigation into power, law, governance, and the real machinery behind India's political future. Think of today as the closing argument of one case and the opening summon for the next. Because a republic doesn't evolve through silence. It evolves through interrogation, through clarity, through courage, through citizens who refuse to be passive. So as this constitutional dialogue series comes to an end, I want to leave you with one thought. The Constitution doesn't belong to lawyers or judges. It belongs to you. And the day you start speaking to it, not as a distant authority, but as a partner, that day the Republic becomes stronger than every crisis around it. This chapter closes here and the next begins soon. Stay ready, stay thoughtful, stay difficult to manipulate. And as always, this is the next hearing where we don't just interpret the law, we interrogate power. And the dialogue continues. I am Amod and we will meet again in the next hearing. Thank you.